Hi guys, so today I'll be reviewing EOC A and EOC B. So I will first look at EOC A, and within EOC A, obviously we have our main argument, which is 3 claims, our line of reasoning, which consists of 5 to 6 major claims, and then finally you have to evaluate evidence for row 3, and it typically requires 2 to 3 pieces of evidence, but on the day of the exam, it's heavily recommended that you do 3 pieces of evidence, so keep that in mind. And just before I even go into anything, a lot of people tend to come to me and say that they struggle with their time management for EOCA. Here's my personal strategy for EOCA. So, for reading the article, I recommend that you spend between maybe 7 to 8 minutes reading. So, I'll type that. So, that's the first thing you do. And then you should spend, and this depends on the order in which you do things. I go in a 1, 2, 3 order. So this is, I'll write that 1, 2, 3. All right, so this is the way that I go, but obviously there's some people who go in a different order. So if you're one of those people, just ignore this part, but let's move on. So I spend 7 to 8 minutes reading. I spend approximately 2 minutes answering row 1, and then I spend 10 minutes on rows 2 and 3. Yeah, so with that being said, this will pretty much add up to 30 minutes because this is 20 minutes. So yeah, so let's get right into the actual EOCA. So within EOCA, you'll typically have 2 types of articles. You will have either a solution or a main problem. And a lot of the ones that we see in EOCA typically follow a solution, but the one we most recently did was the voting age one, which actually did not have a solution and it just had a main problem. So I'll go into both of those right now. So I'll first focus on the early childhood education article, which came from our first full-length exam. So a thing that a lot of people tend to do for row 1, which gets them a 2, is 2 main things. First, people effectively evaluate the first 2 major claims of the main argument that the article makes, but they actually miss the solution. So a big way that I address this issue is that I look at the last 2 paragraphs of the article. So the most important thing that you should do for row 1 is make sure that you look at the end of the article, which typically like the last 2 or 3 paragraphs, because it will include the 3rd claim. So right here it talks about so the main argument is that there are people with, or there are children with unequal access to higher education at a young age, and this higher education can have benefits for your economic, your educational, and social life, whatever. And cool, if you identified those 2 major claims, cool, that'll get you a 2. But a major thing that a lot of people missed was the last part, which was actually the call to action to have increased advocacy for greater education. So they include like a example of California and how they're doing it. And you just had to hit the mark of how there should be increased advocacy for increasing higher education. Now, this was last week, so I might have the wording slightly wrong. So just in case, this is my response that I had for row 1. So if you want to pause, you can read. A huge thing that a lot of my classmates and people that come to me tell me that they're doing for row 1 is that a lot of people actually try to write only 1 sentence for row 1, which I know that's what we're taught in class to do, but actually I feel like if you write more, it's okay. I typically write 2 to 3 sentences just because I'm someone who at first I would always get like somewhere like around a 2 or really close to a 3, but still a 2, because I just wouldn't write enough. So you should get out of your head of trying to make this super short response for row 1. And I feel like you should try to be more flexible with having a little bit more for row 1, just to guarantee that you will get a 3. Because a big thing that I want you guys to think about is it's better to have more stuff and be right than have less and be wrong. Because I know that we're taught that having like a super short response is like the standard way for row 1, but me personally, I just recommend writing a little bit more just to ensure that you're getting a 3 on this part. But yeah, so with that being said, That is for a solution-based article. Typically, throughout the article, they'll just talk about like the two major things that they're arguing for. And in the last two paragraphs, or three, but this one's two, it'll just give you the solution. So keep your eyes out for the last couple paragraphs because that will definitely include the third major claim. But with that being said, this is not the only type of article you will see. So I have to go to the second type of article. So this one was our voting age article, which did not have a solution. But similar to how I said previously, if you look at the end of the article, they actually have like a little short conclusion slash summary that actually wraps up the entire argument. So literally every single thing that was required in row one was literally at the end of the article. And now with that being said, I'm not necessarily saying that you'll find the entire argument in the last couple paragraphs. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there's a large part that is actually found in the end, which a lot of people tend to miss. So of course, obviously, still read all of this because obviously it'll tell you like the main basis of the argument, but always keep your eyes out for like the end because that's also very important and it'll help you out to get a 3. So yeah, those are all of my tips for row 1. So with that being said, we'll move on to row 2. So row 2 is the line of reasoning, and you typically include 5 to 6 major claims made by the author. And a large thing that a lot of people tend to do that gets you a 4 in row 2 is that people tend to write their line of reasoning in like a sequential order. And what I mean by that is that a lot of people just say like, first the author says blah blah blah, then the author says da da da. Like as a reader, I'm thinking like cool, like you can name out all the claims, but where's the connection at? Like as a reader, I'm thinking that these are all like their own blocks, and these blocks are very distant from each other. Like there's no connection. So what I tend to recommend for row 2 is that a lot of people have concerns or struggles about their synthesis or like how they connect their claims. So a big way that I typically address this issue for people is that I look at transitional phrases. So let's just copy that over here. Let's just unhighlight this because this looks bad. Okay, so a big thing for row 2 and even row 3 actually is oh, this is big, sorry. Okay, there we go. Is your transitional phrases. And with transitional phrases, it gives the illusion to the reader that you're having connections slash synthesis, and it also just elevates the quality of your writing by a lot, because if you're just saying first, then, next, moreover, okay, cool, but like that's very elementary. So as a reader, I think that a grader would be looking for this, like especially this type of phrasing, like further explains his previous claim, his or her claim, connects to his or her previous claim by illustrating. All of this kind of gives the illusion that you're having a connection from your claims, but that's obviously not enough. Like if you say this, but your claims are still like pretty bland, that'll still get you a 4. But this is a big way to nudge your writing up to be at a higher level than just having it be super basic like this. So that's my first major tip, but obviously there's more. So a big thing that's pretty obvious at this point is write a lot. And what I mean by that is like you should write at least like for the person to, scroll, like make the person that's grading your EOCA scroll, because this will demonstrate that you actually like understand the line of reasoning and you wrote a lot. Like literally like not even like reading it, but like just looking at it, like the reader has like a better impression of it because of how long it is. And another major thing that I recommend that you don't do is do not separate anything in row 2. Like do not add any spaces. Don't do that, because I feel like as a reader that kind of just takes away from like the connection between your claims, because if they're all on their own, like if they're all like in their own little like section, how would you know that they're being synthesized? And also, I don't know, it just takes away from the lengthiness that it has. So don't do that. But for the row 3, I do recommend doing that. Like over here I did that, but that'll be touched on later. But back on this, I actually recommend that you write between 3 to 4 sentences per claim. Like, obviously, write a lot, explain what the claim is, explain how the claim advances the argument, and explain how the claims relate to each other or even contrast each other. And by doing so, you can ensure that you're getting a 6 on this row. So, yeah. Also, a major tip that I noticed that a lot of people like kind of don't do is always have like a little like cute little sentence in the start, like say, "Oh, throughout the article, the author utilizes a wide variety of claims to establish," or blah blah blah. Like always have a little blanket statement in the start, or like even here, like have like a little sentence saying, "Oh, throughout the article, the author does blah blah blah." It's just a personal preference that I have that I think definitely supports your overall EOCA. With that being said, let's now look at row 3. So a big thing that I see that people do is one, they do not include a blanket statement at the start. So if you're not doing that now, start doing it. And now next, I noticed that a lot of people just say like the author cites person and person has a PhD. They are credible. Like obviously not in this exact wording, but like basically like it reads like that, which this is horrible. So do not do this ever. What I do recommend you do is you have to first explain who the author is citing, and you have to like explain what this author is even saying. So like if you were to just say, "Oh, the author cites so and so," and then period. Okay, what are they citing? Like you have to explain what exactly this author is saying and explain what this piece of evidence is. And not only that, but also like explain how this claim even advances the author's argument. Like you have to evaluate how and why the author selected this piece of evidence in place of their overall argument, which kind of ties into row 2 actually. And so once you say who the author is, what the evidence is, and how the evidence supports the argument, then you can move on to evaluating the credibility of the evidence and evaluate how relevant slash reliable it is. And a big thing that people do is like a lot of people's evidence evaluation is very basic. Like just because someone has like a PhD or has like expertise or a degree, like sure that makes them credible, but like you can go a lot more in depth. Like this row is something that like I tell people like literally make stuff up. Like pretend that your reader is 5 years old, like they were born literally yesterday. Like you don't want your reader to assume literally anything. Like you want to make it so obvious. Like even if like it's literally the most obvious thing ever, you have to still say it because that's what's gonna get you a 6 on this row. So good things to evaluate for like flaws in like the effectiveness of the evidence is, does the author even establish credibility? So for most of these, yes, they do. So this is an example of like obviously establishing credibility. Maybe they could have a degree. So according to Professor Smith from Harvard University, obviously they can include like something like a subject or whatever. I just typed that really fast. So this is a good piece of evidence, but a big thing about a lot of articles is that they tend to come from like a journal article. So something that I love to call out for row 3 is like, does the author include the journal? And why is this a problem? Well, a lot of journals can be either objective or biased. So you want to call out, does the author include a journal? Can this journal be biased? If it's biased, then it's a major problem for the credibility of this evidence. But since it's not included, the reader will never know. Also, an example of like a really bad piece of evidence that actually pops up in a lot of EOCA articles is that the author might say like, numerous studies indicate that eating apples improves cognitive thinking. Like, that's a random piece of evidence, by the way. Don't like, you know. But this is an example of like an author saying something very unspecific and not explaining it at all. Like you have no idea what numerous studies even is. Like you don't know when this was done, what these studies are, who they experimented. Like you don't know if it's outdated. Like there's a lot you can say. So here's just like a little like quick rundown of like all the stuff I said. Like you could say like, is it objective? Is it biased or not biased? What journal does it come from? Like if they refer to a study, what study? Another thing like, who was experimented Like, did they ever include that? Like, what year was this done? Like, it could have been done in like 1982. Like, you would never know. So always like think outside the box. Like, pull like random stuff out. Like make sure like you at least have like 12 sentences for each piece of evidence, because that'll really like get you a 6 on row 3. So one of the EOCA articles that I think that both period 3 and 4 had was about the tipping industry, and it talks about this guy who works as a restaurateur. And a lot of people said that because he's a restaurateur, he's credible in the argument of restaurants. But you could actually say that he might be a little bit biased, because since he's a restaurateur, he might be writing like in favor of restaurants and not actually having like a full wide range of the argument. So you could be saying, oh, like, is the author writing from personal experience? Could they be biased? Could they hurt their credibility through this? You want to include as much as you can for row 3. Another major thing that a lot of people tend to forget is that let's say that your argument, so let's say main argument is about economics, right? But let's say the author cites somebody who has a PhD in philosophy. So as a reader, I'm like, okay, this person has a PhD, but it's in philosophy. What does this have to do with economics? So obviously, like, you can definitely call that out. You can say, although the person that the evidence comes from is credible because they have a doctorate degree, their degree doesn't actually have to do anything with the main argument. So could that be them not being credible in the argument of economics? Of course. So always, always, always try to include that, because it will strengthen your argument. And again, I recommend separating your response for row 3, because that shows the reader that your claims are organized, and it just gives them a good impression of your writing right off the start. So yeah, just some things to consider. So if you have any questions, just message me. But yeah, so if you want to look at my responses, I'm just gonna scroll. I'm not gonna like really. So just look at that. And yeah, so that's it for EOCA. Let's focus on EOCB now. So this will be a bit shorter because EOCB is a lot more independent and not strategy based, but there's still some things to go over. So for EOCB, you need at least 4 paragraphs, and it consists of your intro, your 2 body paragraphs, and your conclusion. And something major that you must have in your essay is a clear thesis statement. What this is that it goes at the end of your intro, and it's basically what your central argument is, and it shows the reader what you'll focus on throughout your essay. So I'll show you guys a quick example of a thesis statement that I wrote. So for the first full-length exam, I believe that the theme was isolation and connection. And for one of the sources in the packet, it talks a lot about broadband. And as far as what this is, it basically just means Wi-Fi. So my thesis statement was that people living in rural areas and low-income individuals do not have equal access to broadband, aka Wi-Fi, and this limits them from having educational and social opportunities. Bam. This sentence shows my reader what I'll focus on in my essay, and it lines up the main points of my essay. And this shows the grader what to focus on. And without this sentence, the grader basically has no idea what my essay will be about. And this is a major problem because it's a big part of row 1, which is basically about the main point of your argument, and also if you even get what the theme is. So keep this in mind and always make sure you have your thesis. And something that a lot of people like to do is that they like to have a question. So let's pretend this is my question. You have to have an answer to that question. So let's say this little piece is my question. This will be the answer. So always remember that. And now to move on, something pretty obvious, but just to include, you need to have at least 2 sources, but it's recommended to have 3. When you're skimming the sources, I recommend that you weed out the one that you don't understand. I don't recommend that you waste your time trying to decipher something that you don't get, because that'll just take up time and you're obviously on a time limit here. So I like to weed out the ones that like have poetry or the sources that are up for interpretation. So just to keep that in mind, if you're someone who likes these sources, by all means, read it, but just for me, I just don't like them. And a huge thing that I recommend when you're doing EOCB is utilize your scratch paper. When you're reading these sources, not only should you be trying to obviously decipher what the theme is, which is again a major part, assess what the theme is, but also try to write bullet points down for potential ideas of what you want to write about in your essay. So when you read each of these sources, I want you guys to try to write bullet points of maybe what the text reminds you of. Think of maybe like real world issues, something you see on social media. Try to think of something so you can have, a clear idea of what you want to focus on. And another pretty basic but important strategy to have in EOCB is read the title of each source because it'll maybe give you an idea of what the theme is without even reading the articles. So another thing to consider is now each rubric row. But before we get into that, I just want to quickly go over establishing credibility and properly citing. So this is something that I see that a lot of people tend to do wrong at first. So in order to prevent this, I want you guys to look at the start. So look at the title and who it's from. So a lot of people typically say, according to Francesca Street, comma, blah, 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 source A. Or some people even say, according to source A, blah, 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 blah. These are both wrong. And that's because you have to say who the author is and what they come from or what their credentials are. So for this source, it says that it's by Francesca Street and it says that it's from CNN. So what I would say is Francesca Street, who is associated with CNN, states blah, 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 parentheses, source A. That is how you properly cite this. For the next source, let's look at this. Next source is from Janice McCabe, but it actually gives you her credibility. But not all of the sources are like this, but for the ones that are like this, take it to your advantage and cite that. And to move on to source C, this is by Colleen McLean, and it says that she's from the Pew Research Center. So you could say, Colleen McLean, who is associated with the Pew Research Center, states blah, 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 parentheses, source C. Perfect. That is how you cite. Please, please, please remember that. If you're going to take anything away from this video, please remember how to cite your sources because it is a big part of row 4, apply conventions. It's not only grammar, but also how you properly cite. So please keep that in mind for completing your essay. And as far as the rubric goes, the first one is whether or not you understand the theme. So I'm going to also write that, understand theme. Perfect. Row 2 is line of reasoning. So I have a very small tip for line of reasoning. I actually recommend in your essay, this is my own personal preference, but I think it makes a huge difference. Please include headers. So for here, I say introduction, educational imbalance, social limitations, and conclusion. And the reason why I include it is because I think that it gives like an organized feel to my essay, and it also gives my reader like an understanding of what I will focus on in each paragraph before they even go into it. Because you have to imagine that a lot of the people grading your EOC A and B have probably read dozens of responses, even hundreds. So please, please, please try to consider that these people are tired. These people probably don't want to read your paper. They're probably hungry. They probably just want to go home. So having something like this makes it a lot easier on their end to actually decipher what you're talking about. Versus if you didn't have it, well, then they'd probably just be trying to figure out what you're even talking about in this paragraph. Because I know that I would read some of my peers' EOCBs, and although they were good, I would still be a bit confused on what their paragraph was even about. So I feel that having a header is very good. Something important about row 2 is that when you're going to introduce a claim, make sure that it actually makes sense in how you're arguing something. So for example, if I were to argue that the fast food industry in the United States promotes unhealthy diets, cool. And then if I were to introduce Colleen McLean and she's talking about something way different, that makes no sense. And I see that a lot of people tend to unknowingly do this. Like they would introduce their main argument and then they would cite somebody, but the connection wouldn't really make sense. So to make this in line with row 2 for your line of reasoning, try to word things in a way where it will flow nicely into your argument and also make it make sense. And a big mistake that I notice in a lot of people's writing for EOCB is that they tend to try to like summarize what the author's main argument is, or they try to literally word for word copy what the author says, but then in response to this, their argument basically makes no sense. So, what I recommend for this is try to paraphrase what the author is saying while also wording it in a way where it will flow nicely in your argument to make it make sense for row 2. And another small tip for row 3, which is synthesis, which I know a lot of people have concerns regarding synthesis, is that if you struggle with this, I tend to put two authors in the same sentence to kind of throw it in the reader's face that I'm synthesizing. So I'll look for an example up here. So let's look here. So this is a sentence. I think this is a bit long, but it's fine. So I wrote, additionally, McLean's findings further exemplify the gravity that broadband truly has. While McCabe's evidence finds that college students having social connections among friends can bolster academic and emotional support, McLean's report establishes that these connections are widely achieved through high-speed internet access. Boom. This is an example of how I use two authors in the same sentence and I directly combine them to show the reader how I'm synthesizing them. Obviously, this is not the only synthesis I have. If you only have one piece of synthesis in your entire paragraph, I hate to break it to you, but that's not enough to get you a 6. So I recommend that you synthesize all throughout the paragraph because it definitely will help. And as far as how you can do that, try to incorporate something like this. Like you can say something similar, like I have another sentence where I put the same two authors in the same two sentences to show a direct synthesis. So I said, this problem illustrated by McCabe is only further exemplified when considering evidence from McLean, where she states blah, 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 blah. You see how I'm putting them in line with each other? This kind of throws it in the grader's face that I'm directly synthesizing them. So they can't deny that there's no synthesis going on here, which is a pretty basic but effective strategy to implement for row 3. And now to move on to row 4, which is grammar. I don't have much suggestions for row 4, but what I will say is once you're done writing every single individual paragraph, before you move on to the next paragraph, I want you to read every single word that you wrote and make sure that there's no typos. And if there is, try to fix those as fast as you can. Revision should not take longer than 2 minutes because you're just reading what you wrote, which shouldn't be longer than maybe like 12 sentences at max. So just read that, fix what you wrote, move on. Don't try to rush through everything because then you'll have a bunch of typos and not even realize it. So that's a big thing that I recommend for row 4. And then one more thing about the essay is that once you know how you have your thesis up here, when you are writing your conclusion, I want you guys to actually restate your thesis, but in different wording. So up here, I say that a lack of Wi-Fi access limits people from having educational and social opportunities. Good. Down here, I essentially say the same thing, I just say it in literally like a different wording. That's a common strategy that's used in a lot of essay writing, and I think that it's a good way to overall just tie in your argument and strengthen the quality of your writing. But with that being said, that's all the tips I have for EOCB. So I hope that you guys all enjoyed this, and I hope that you took something out of this. So good luck on the exam on Monday, and I'm sure that all of you guys will do great.